think just broadly, within REA, probably like a lot of businesses, the Netflixes of the world and the Amazons and the Facebooks are sort of leading the way in that way of thinking and really celebrating failure. So, I see experimentation as a really core part of that, and really highlighting that it's okay to fail, be bold in your experiments. And if they don't work, then it's a really good insight for everybody else.
Hello and welcome to Experimentation Masters, the leading resource for business experimentation. Join fellow innovators, strategists and entrepreneurs to learn practical tips, methods and techniques from world-leading experts in experimentation. Design better experiments, lead with more confidence and have greater impact in your organization. Now please welcome your host, Gavin Bryant.
Hello and welcome to the Experimentation Masters podcast. Today, I would like to welcome James Slayter to the show. James is the Head of Product Membership at REA Group. REA Group is a leading digital business that specialises in global real estate advertising, with a presence in Australia, Asia, Europe, and North America. In this episode, we're going to discuss how James established and scaled experimentation group-wide at REA Group. Welcome to the show, James.
Thanks, Gavin.
So I thought a good place to start for our audience, James, would be to provide a little bit of background and an overview of where you got started with your journey on experimentation.
Yeah, sure. So I guess my sort of background, I came from Jetstar prior to REA. So obviously a major kind of e-commerce operation. And was actually really lucky at Jetstar in that I took over a team. We had sort of a small kind of team. It was kind of a one-man show, really, that was running experiments, on the website. And then they were able to put up a business case and sort of get a consultancy on board. And that consultancy then were able to kind of really sort of take data and use data to drive the backlog and to sort of help us get started with experimentation. So I ended up taking over that team and sort of really helping to run that team and establish it and embed it within Jetstar. So we sort of started off with a centralized team that would run all of the experiments, and this was done by the consultancy, and then really look to move and democratize that into the product teams. So really try and embed that into the product manager's way of thinking.
Excellent. And thinking more recently to the experimentation journey at REA Group, what's that look like?
So obviously I came to REA about 3 years ago now, and was really interested in getting into a sort of a core tech business and seeing the way that they operate compared to sort of a more e-commerce or an airline type business. And they were doing experimentation. There were some teams that were testing out, a sort of financial services team as well as our leads team. Were running experiments and they were being quite successful. They were running quite a few experiments and sort of testing around the edges of our core experience. Most of the eyeballs that we get are on our sort of property details page and our search results page, as you can imagine. Lots of people searching photos. So there are a lot of people running experiments sort of on the sides of the site. So I think coming into REA, I definitely saw an opportunity to bring experimentation into those core pages. So I really sort of took it on, just given my background in experimentation at Jetstar and the scale that we had there. Saw an opportunity to come in and really start to upskill some of the people and the product managers and the teams that were working in those core pages to help try and drive outcomes for some of those key conversion metrics.
Excellent. So thinking about your personal philosophy or guiding principles around experimentation, what are some of those guiding principles that you've formed over the past few years?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, look, I think probably the first one is to keep it simple. Experimentation can get quite complex, especially when you think about when you start talking about statistical significance and, all of the different mathematics that sits behind how you tell whether an experiment's a winner and the different variants and how you implement it. But try and keep it simple as much as possible. So when I say that, it's really about targeting one metric at a time. Definitely, I've sort of seen time and time again, people that are getting started in experimentation want to measure multiple things with the one experiment. But I guess my sort of guiding principle and learnings over time is that the more that you can focus on that single metric, generally the more successful those tests are. Also, spend the time and get the hypothesis right, I think is another really important one. It's really worth sitting down and thinking about what you want to achieve and having a really good hypothesis statement, so sort of in the framework of if, then, because, or that's generally the one that we use at REA. So I think, spend the time and get the hypothesis right. And then always think about secondary metrics is probably one of the other kind of principles that I like to take in there. So it's not just about testing the one thing. Obviously, keep it simple and use one metric, but definitely look at how it impacts some of the other metrics around the experience. So you just want to make sure that you're not increasing conversion in one space, but then actually decreasing conversion or user experience in another space.
Excellent. Let's just discuss a couple of those elements for a moment. So at REA Group, do you have a core set of metrics that effectively product teams choose from, or is that shifting based on the demands of the experiment?
Look, sort of when I came in, everything was the agile teams at REA were really empowered to work their own way. So there's obviously, broader company metrics that get used, but teams are really sort of in charge of their own destiny to a degree. So there are definitely core metrics. The amount of property views that we get is obviously important for our agents, the number of people that save properties, save searches, log in, those kind of pretty simple ones that I guess everyone's keeping their eye on. But we've definitely got some adjacency businesses that do have slightly different metrics. We've got a financial services arm that tries to drive home loans and leads to brokers. So that would generally be some of their metrics, filling out calculators. And then on the other side, our sole leads business is really looking at kind of qualified leads to agents. So they might be targeting other things. So all of that does come back into the core experience. So on our sort of property details page and our search results page. So people are continually trying to optimize in there. But I think, so it sort of changes from team to team. But we obviously want to make sure some of those core metrics don't get impacted by the different experiments.
Good point. And thinking about hypothesis statements, what are some of the challenges that you see that teams have with setting the hypotheses prior to the experiment?
Look, I think, as I said before, it's probably around too many metrics. So trying to focus on too many things at once. Generally keeping it crisp and trying to sort of highlight one metric is definitely something I see. Also, I think probably taking a research or an insight or some analysis that leads to that hypothesis statement. I think the because part of the hypothesis statement is quite important. So if we change this button color, then we'll see a 5% uplift because, I think sometimes, you say, well, because we just think people will like that, whereas I think it's great to have an insight or a piece of research or a piece of analysis or a metric that is that because.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that the hypotheses, it's not a guess, that it's grounded and anchored in some form of qualitative insight or quantitative research.
Correct.
So thinking about leadership effectiveness, as a head of product, how do you find that experimentation helps you to lead more effectively?
Look, it's a good question. I think that probably one of the big things that I think experimentation enables more broadly and also comes down to leadership too is being able to enable data-driven decision-making. And I think that that's something that really allows, that really gives people the opportunity to galvanise together around, if you are quite a metric-driven business and, most, commercial businesses are, being able to sort of take out the opinions sometimes out of decisions and to really make sure that you're making decisions and leading based on either North Star metrics or tangible metrics that can then be tested and optimized and measured, I think just enables clarity in leadership. And I think, there's sort of I don't know whether you probably call it an acronym, but the Hippo Principle, which is the highest paid person's opinion. And I think that what it does is, by having experimentation, it actually takes some of that out. So I think it empowers, product managers and designers and analysts and, people in the business to really challenge, existing opinions and challenge the status quo a bit. And I think that helps, that definitely helps leaders in that, you've got more and more people that are contributing to the decision-making process.
Yep. Excellent summary there. So thinking about the experimentation journey at REA Group, you came in from Jetstar Airways. What was that initial sort of ground zero assessment that you had? You mentioned that some of the teams were performing experiments. There were pockets of the business that were experimenting and they were experimenting effectively. What was your initial assessment of culture and capability?
So I guess coming in initially, as I said before, there was some really capable people that were running experiments and running them. They had quite a good velocity in the number of experiments they were running. They were using sort of more of the client side experimentation sort of tools, and there was definitely a culture in those teams of testing everything. And probably purely because there wasn't an experimentation tool in those core pages, the teams that were working in those spaces probably weren't as sort of up to date with experimentation. So that was sort of the gap that I guess I saw, was how do we get a tool into those core pages and really start to build that momentum. So I think that there was definitely a sort of a culture of people starting to use data to make decisions. But I think also when I joined, there was just a big re-platforming project had just taken place that I think had used up quite a few of the teams. So there was definitely a big scope to deliver there. And I think people were sort of ready to get into the experimentation space, but there sort of hadn't been, I guess, a centralised team or capability to help train that. So there were definitely some opportunities. I think when I joined, there were 3 or 4 different experimentation tools being used around the business in varying ways. So again, trying to centralise things a little bit and distill that down into one tool was something that I felt could add a lot of value, just because everybody's talking the same language, everybody's using the same tool, everybody's sort of experimenting in a similar-ish way. So, yeah, I think there was definitely a culture of people wanting to learn and wanting to do new things. And I think that's really what's helped drive the experimentation culture today.
Excellent. One of the key things you mentioned there was consolidation and rationalization of platforms, so a one-tool focus. What were some of the other key elements of that experimentation journey to really simplify and to build skill and capability across the business?
I think to begin with, probably starting with a bit of a framework on how to run experimentation or how to run experiments. So, putting together some docs around, what does a good hypothesis statement look like? Sort of took an experiment calculator on something that can give you a quick idea of statistical significance. That helped teams sort of work out whether or not their experiment would even gain statistical significance and how long it would take. So sort of educating people a little bit on that to look at, and then I think people start to understand what, the lift over control needs to look like, what the sort of traffic needs to look like, what kind of conversion rates you might need to get to actually run the experiment. So there was a bit of training there. Definitely highlighting the benefits of experimentation and how much it can benefit the different metrics that the teams have. So yeah, I think sort of setting up that framework, also getting the tech community on board was probably another really key piece to that. There were definitely some hesitations around putting a client-side tool into our most highly trafficked pages, just because of the potential impact on page load times, on just general performance. There's opportunities, or there's some risk of it flickering. When they first load that experience, the page can flicker a bit to the new version. So there was some hesitation there. So definitely getting the tech teams on board, and we used a server-side product for that reason, which does move a lot of the sort of the setup of the experiments into the development teams, which can slow things down a little bit. Obviously, you can run things a lot quicker if a product manager can jump in and change some copy or change a button color or move some things around. But I guess the complexity with our business is, agents sort of buy that listing for vendors, and that's really their sort of listing. So we sort of can't have too many people going in there and moving things around a page and changing too many things without the proper go-to-market and the approvals from the account managers and agents.
One of the key things that you mentioned there was a capability uplift around some of the fundamentals of experimentation, really the why, what, and how. Are there any strategies that you found really effective in building organisational capability and educating?
I think probably around experimentation, definitely sort of having a bit of an open door policy to help individuals with their individual questions has been something that's definitely helped a bit. Having a regular showcase is also something that I've seen work really well, where you can incorporate a bit of sort of training and an overview of the fundamentals in that showcase. So it's not just a showcase of the results in the experiments, but also an opportunity to bring in guest speakers or to, bring in experts in the field to actually then talk through, how they do experiments and, really create a bit of momentum and a forum around it, get people to, share their experiences. I think it also creates a sort of a bit of a safe place as well. As we all know, with experiments, a lot of them fail, and really coaching people that failing is good in experiments, because often an experiment is much cheaper to set up, is much cheaper to run, and you're not going and spending all of this money and development team time building something that's not going to work. So I think I've been personally, and I've seen time and time again, that people learn more from failed experiments than they do from the successful ones. So I think creating those forums. Also getting sort of people from different sides of the business. When I say different sides, different functions. So building a bit of a team of experts. I'm really lucky to have a few people at REA that are also experts in it, from design to tech, to product, that really enjoy experimentation. So, really bringing them on board, because everybody's got different sort of ways that they approach it. So allowing them to, to train people on those different things.
Let's just double click on failure for a moment. So how did you to shift the needle on the organisation embracing failure more readily?
Look, it's definitely a work in progress. As with most businesses, it's sort of unnatural to make failure okay. But it's definitely something that we're working on, both as kind of an experimentation community within REA, and I think just broadly, within REA, probably like a lot of businesses, the Netflixes of the world and the Amazons and the Facebooks are sort of leading the way in that way of thinking and really celebrating failure. So, I see experimentation as a really core part of that, and really highlighting that it's okay to fail, and that, be bold in your experiments. And if they don't work, then it's a really good insight for everybody else. So we're sort of really hoping that, we can get more people to tell their stories of failure, in the showcases and in the different forums. Because we feel like once you start sort of normalizing those stories of failure a little bit more, you can definitely start changing the culture.
That's a really good point. So thinking back to the showcase, it seems like it's been a really effective communication tool to engender support and communicate within the organisation. Are there any other rituals or ceremonies that the organisation has around experimentation that have been effective?
Yeah, look, I think getting going, when we sort of got started, or when I first started and we got the tool into the core pages, having kind of a weekly or a fortnightly stand-up, obviously with a big company, a big sort of tech business like REA, there's sort of federated models. So, there's teams that are, I guess, custodians of different parts of the code base, and, other teams need to federate into those places. So they're obviously got the teams that own those code bases have vested interest in, the experiments that get run. So to get visibility, running sort of either a weekly or a fortnightly stand-up, whereby, all of the different experiments can kind of be talked about on a Trello wall or, on a Jira wall. We found quite effective to then, keep everybody across exactly where different things are up to. It also really helped with code removal as well, which is probably one of the difficulties with experimentation. Is just, it's all well and good to run your experiment, but once it's finished and you've done all your iterations, making sure that teams go back and clean up all of the quick code that they might have put in there to get the result. So that was quite an effective forum. I think getting going. But for us, unfortunately, COVID hit, and then it sort of, things definitely in the experimentation space slowed down. So we've stopped doing those forums just for now, just because I wanted to see how the business would go and operate, without that structure, to see whether teams, would still do the required stakeholder management and keep different teams across all the experiments that are going on. So I think that, trying to remove as much governance as possible has sort of been one of my principles. Even though we started with the governance, I think to get it going, I've really wanted to, let teams go and do their thing and try and keep it really lean and mean. But, and that obviously comes with its challenges. So I think it's for lack of a better word, it's all part of the optimization of it all. So I think, that stand-up was probably a good forum. I think that the showcase was another good forum, and then really getting the word out there. So if there's town halls, if there's opportunities to sort of share experiments or results, I think that really helps to start building the culture.
Yep. So thinking about some of those challenges that you just alluded to, so what are the key challenges that you've had to face into along to that journey?
There's definitely been a few. I think initially just that, probably getting the buy-in from the business to sort of spend the time really integrating a tool into our kind of core experience. Because it had to be server-side, it obviously needed a team dedicated to that, and traditionally there hadn't been a team that was dedicated to experimentation. So there was definitely a bit of work sort of getting business buy-in and highlighting the benefits and consolidating the tools. So I think that was probably one of the first challenges that I faced. I think probably the second one is around sort of analytics. And I think we still face that today. And it's more sort of both sides of the coin. So it's more not only doing the analysis up front to build out a backlog. I've seen that work before, and it's an extremely powerful tool in doing your prioritization. So picking your metrics and, really then analyzing, all of the data associated with those and building out a prioritized backlog of experiments. So I think that having analyst capacity or product manager capacity to do that has been a bit of a challenge. And then on the other side of the coin, doing that post-experiment analysis as well. Again, just, through kind of capacity and time. Often it's the sort of product managers and designers that are running a lot of the experiments at REA. And it's going in that sort of detailed analysis post-experiment, looking at all your secondary metrics, looking at your primary metric, interrogating, all of the page flows afterwards and how it impacted different things. There's some real gold in that post-experimentation analysis. And I think just the sort of the way our analytics are set up, and just the capacity of the people doing it, that's not quite where we want it to be, and is a bit of a challenge at the moment. So I think they're probably the three main ones. I think that probably the last one is, just now starting to link it up with communications as well. So, getting that cross-channel experimentation happening where, you've got an email that's often in a different kind of piece of tech. It's got three different variants, and then they hit a landing page or hit a page on your site that then is matched with three different variants. So, yeah, I think that's going to be sort of our next, is a current challenge, but is definitely the next thing we'll focus on.
You've mentioned that the development teams are obviously critical to be able to enable experimentation. Have you seen any challenges with competing priorities, given that the teams are also fixing bugs, they're delivering key projects as well, and there's a focus around experimentation? Do you often struggle for prioritization?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's a great call, and I think that's in that sort of democratized model. That's definitely one of the challenges. You've really got to have a product manager that's really focused, or a team that's really focused on doing experiments. We've sort of all been in that situation where you've got a big project or a big scope that's not often going to time, and you want to run an experiment, but then other things come up, and it can sometimes get bumped out. I think that's definitely a challenge with that model. Obviously, if you move to more of a center of excellence model, where you've got an autonomous team that can run, experiments wherever they want and whenever they want, sometimes that can be removed.
Mm-hmm. Good point. So at the start of our conversation, we were talking a little bit about how there's been a shift towards more data-informed decision-making. What are some of the leadership changes that you've observed as experimentation has become more prominent in the business?
I think there's definitely been a bit more of a focus around analytics in sort of not just the experimentation space, but I think just the analytics more general. We've obviously got teams of analysts and data scientists and those sort of things at REA, very, very capable people. I think just the analytics focus on experimentation is something that we're starting to see change a little bit from a leadership standpoint, which I think is really positive. And I think also that leaders are really starting to champion the results of experiments and the data that they get from the experiments, not only the uplift that they get from, the conversion increases, but also the ability to use data in different, strategies and approaches. So I think that, also I've probably also seen in the design community that definitely the leaders that have been more into experimentation are sort of taking more of those senior roles and really starting to drive that from the top down. So I think that's been a really positive shift, because definitely seeing, user experience and UI designers, start thinking, with experimentation at every step really helps the product managers and the teams, just embedded in their everyday thinking.
Excellent point. So you've had some really strong exposure across two multinational organisations now, establishing and growing experimentation. What are some of the key mistakes that you think that organisations can potentially make when trying to commence experimentation?
Yeah, look, I think, there's that classic kind of crawl, walk, run type methodology that I definitely, it's obviously a pretty common one, but I heard first from a consultancy called the Lumery. And I really like it in that, I think that one of the mistakes that teams or organisations can make when they're getting started is sort of trying to run before they can crawl. So, trying to go too big too early. I think, starting small and really targeting one or two metrics to begin with a small team is really what's key to getting started. I think if you try and go too big and too broad, then it can get a bit confusing and a bit out of hand, and you're not actually sure what you're learning. So, yeah, I think that's probably one of the big ones. Probably another, I guess, key mistake is it's probably not a mistake, but it's probably just a learning from I guess my experience doing it is, really having an analyst, like someone that like a data analyst there from the get-go, or someone that's really kind of into the data, I think is also a really key part of an experimentation program success. Have it driven out of data science or analytics, or, I think the data really does the talking. So I think that, having an analyst at the beginning can really help. And if you don't, it sometimes is harder to get traction. And I think that's probably one of the things I definitely learned at REA. We didn't have a lot of analysts sort of in I guess, my space of the business. So really rising up and bubbling those data insights up to senior management can really help. And I think that's definitely a learning I've taken from here is have an analyst from the get-go and have them, really championing the results.
Okay, just to summarize there. So think about stay small, stay local to begin, and strong analytics support to begin.
Yeah.
Question around strategy. So obviously the experiments are closely linked back into strategic tactics and broader strategic objectives. How readily have you seen in REA, we're talking a little bit about failure before, have you seen product roadmaps change based on experimentation results, or maybe more broadly elicit a strategic shift?
Look, I think there's been a few examples of it. I think there's definitely sort of in my space, we sort of tried to run experiments to validate whether or not a concept is there. I think, and then all businesses have KPIs or OKRs or, kind of North Star metrics that they reach for. So mapping things back to that is always, really important, and making sure that they're sort of set up and measurable from the beginning is the key to doing that. But yeah, I think that, it really comes down to kind of being able to challenge some of those metrics as well, and running an experiment first to validate your idea or validate that particular metric or that strategic objective. So I guess one of the examples that we've got that I've got at the moment is sort of around a guides type experience, and would people use a checklist? And we wanted to kind of test that first because managing where everybody's up to in a particular checklist or guide could be quite complex from a technical perspective. So being able to experiment with that first and, put enough tracking on the page to then see if people would actually use a checklist the way that we want to was probably one way that we were able to validate that it probably wasn't a great idea, and that we probably wouldn't pursue that checklist type concept. And, that kind of fed into a few different strategic objectives and OKRs. And I think then that's allowed us to, probably pivot towards some others that we're now going to focus on. So without sort of going into too much detail on that one, that's probably one example of where I've seen, experimentation, be able to inform a change or a change in product direction or a strategic objective.
Yeah. So thinking about your key pieces of advice, what are some of the key pieces of advice that you give to organisations that wanted to make a start with experimentation? We've briefly touched on stay small, stay local, and have a strong focus on analytics. Is there anything else that comes to mind?
Look, I think probably defining one or two high-impact, measurable business metrics to begin with is really important. Also doing some analysis or research up front to build out your experiment backlog. If you are going to get started, I think that's really important. And there's a thing called ICE scoring, so impact, confidence, and effort. If you can sort of Google it, you can find a few different ways to set it up, but that helps you just start to shape a backlog. I think having quite a clearly defined and prioritized backlog to begin with is quite important when you're getting started. Dedicating a small team and going as hard as you can at those one or two metrics for a quarter or 2 quarters is something that I've seen work quite well. I think having a small team that's autonomous, that can really not be, kind of bothered by other things when you're getting started, I think that can really deliver a lot of value and highlight to the business that it's worth doing. And then I think once you've done those 1 or 2 quarters for each of the successful experiments or even the unsuccessful ones as well, forecasting out the annualized opportunity. So if that conversion uplift, let's say your experiment showed that it was getting 5% better conversion, what would that actually look like for that metric when you annualized it over a full financial year? Those metrics, that's when the metrics can actually look really powerful. If you were to ramp that up to 100% of people and everyone was converting at 5% more, what would that mean for the business? Mm-hmm. So they're probably the 4 things that I recommend.
Just to touch on prioritization for a moment, with a lot of the ideas and concepts and initiatives that are generated up front, we're not a good judge of what ideas will work and what won't. How much organisational effort and time do you spend curating these raw ideas? Or is it more of just a quick pass to be able to run them through an ICE framework?
Look, it depends on the team. I think different teams have got different approaches. Some teams have used the ICE scoring before, and that's proved as quite effective in helping them with their backlogs. It can be a little bit subjective sometimes, the ICE score. So I would definitely caution at that. It's definitely good to have quite a few people in the room if you are talking about an ICE score, and try and get a bit of an average. But in terms of validating the ideas, I think it's important to get the design team really across, that, and make sure that it's part of a, kind of a future direction, and the UX has been thought through, especially for the bigger experiments. So I guess that's probably one of the validation points. I think also just sort of bringing those types of ideas to the experimentation showcase as well, to talk them through when they're in that idea phase. I think that sometimes helps people validate what they're doing and talk it through, and you've got other people who are, thinking about totally different spaces to have their input. So that can sometimes be an effective way for people to really validate those different ideas. And then I think the final one's just around sort of the data analysis. So if your idea was going to work, what do you need to, if it was going to improve by 5%, what would that mean? And do you actually think that's reasonable? So kind of trying to validate that metric and the uplift as much as possible is important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thinking about 3 closing questions now. Number 1, signature question. So thinking back across your time at Jetstar and REA, has there been an experiment that you've performed that completely reframed organisational perspective?
Let's try to think.
Yeah, what would be a good example of an experiment that was performed that shifted understanding and potentially assumptions?
Look, I think probably the biggest one that I'll highlight is probably from Jetstar. So at Jetstar we had airlines in Singapore, Vietnam, and Japan, and there was a huge issue with people in Japan queuing up at the airport. Like, the airports were just overwhelmed with people queuing up, and no one was buying bags on our website before they get to the airport. They were all basically paying for them at the desk, which was causing a nightmare for the operations. And we had no idea why. And we went there and we did a whole bunch of user research where we got sort of both an interpreter to interpret the language, but then also kind of a cultural interpreter to sort of say, well, they're saying this thing, but they actually mean this thing. So we did a whole bunch of research and we actually started experimenting on the bags page on the website. And what we figured out, it wasn't until we actually went to Japan, or the team went to Japan. I didn't go on this particular trip. And they were standing there ordering a coffee, and they had, kind of their coffees were in sort of, small, like most things, it's like extra small, medium, large, and extra large. And, we were constantly going for the weights in the baggage weights that people would buy. And it sort of triggered an idea that, maybe we should move to more of this coffee style of ranking for our different baggage weights. And after kind of validating that with some of the people in Japan, I mean, in Japan, they're quite precise. They like to be precise with things. So when they were going on a trip, they're like, well, I don't know whether I'm going to need 15 kilos or 20 kilos or 30 kilos. So I'll just take it to the airport and I'll just weigh it at the airport. And, I don't want to get it wrong kind of thing. I don't want to pay for 20 kilos and only take 8 or only take 15. But they seem to resonate much better. I'm going on a small trip or a medium trip, or I'll probably need a large piece of luggage. And so that seemed to resonate a lot better with them. And we basically made that change, and the queues just died, almost, didn't totally die off, but, dropped significantly from the airports and reduced a lot of strain on the operation. And obviously there was the revenue impact of then a lot more people buying bags because they understood the kind of the scoring system a little bit better.
That's a really good example. It highlights how important it is to do that upfront user research and to understand the customer journey and the pains and the problems and what people are trying to achieve. Great example. So thinking about some resources now, books, blogs, podcasts, what would be your top 3 recommendations to our audience that you've found helpful on your journey?
Oh, good question. Look, I think that there's a lot of kind of online research. I'm just trying to think of sort of specific resources.
Do you have a go-to book? Doesn't have to be experimentation related.
I do, but I just can't remember the name of it. It's been a while. I've probably done more of the stuff by doing what is it called? I can't remember. Sorry, off the top of my head. But I think in terms of resources, I think just sort of really kind of understanding, how to write a good hypothesis, and really understand, what kind of, you don't need to have a full understanding of statistical significance, but definitely kind of having a bit of a feel for the different metrics that are involved in experimentation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, that's not a great answer, but I'll have to come back to that one.
Number 3, if our listeners want to get in contact with you, what's the best way to get in contact?
Look, probably via LinkedIn, I'd say would probably be the best way.
Excellent. Thanks so much for the chat today, James. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks, Gavin.
That's all from this episode of Experimentation Masters. Just one more thing before we say goodbye. We can use your help to keep improving the show. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, you can email at gavin@firstprinciples.ventures. Visit firstprinciples.ventures for show notes, resources, and information. If you enjoyed this show, give us a share on social media. Make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. Experimentation Masters. Lead with more confidence.